And we need to understand that when we're talking about the gospel with other people, there are some things that have to be present in that discussion, or we're not speaking the gospel the way it needs to be spoken. The first thing, I bet you thought I was going to say baptism. The first thing, there has to be a joyful messenger. That is the point of all of this. That's the word. We just talked about it. The word of evangelizing. We evangelize things that we love, things that we're passionate about, things that we enjoy. I have had at least 4 different conversations about the same movie in the last week. All the people, we've got to come talk about this movie. Okay, yeah, and we did, and there was no problem with that. Nobody has come and asked me to talk about the movie that preceded it about a month ago, because nobody cared. Nobody was passionate about it. Nobody was that interested in it. We evangelize about things that we love, the things that we are excited about. And this is when we talk about the good news. And let's look over to Isaiah chapter 52. We alluded to this during the week with Stephen. I want to go back and read this again. Isaiah chapter 52. I think it's useful to remember when we talk about the gospel account, when it was first preached, what that meant to the people who heard it. How it is described, the language that is used. Isaiah chapter 52, verses 7 through 10, it says, "How beautiful upon the mountain are the feet of him who bring good news, who publish peace, who bring good news of happiness, who publish salvation, who say to Zion, your God reigns. The voice of your watchmen, they lift up their voice. Together they sing for joy. For eye to eye they see the return of the Lord to Zion. Break forth together into singing, you waste place of Jerusalem. For the Lord has comforted his people. He has redeemed Jerusalem. The Lord has bared his holy arm before the eyes of all the nation, and all the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of our Lord." You can't read that and not feel a sense of excitement. The idea that this is finally happening. This is the thing that has been promised. We've gone, as a people, we've gone through all these things. We've watched our cities be sacked. We've watched our country be ravaged. We've watched all of our sovereignty be taken away. And all the time we wonder ourselves, how can we get back into this relationship with God who seemingly has turned his back on us? And the prophets come and say, there's going to be a time when that news is going to come to you and you're going to receive it with joy and gladness. And you're going to go out talking about the good news. And when we see Jesus' arrival over in Luke chapter 2, just one example, in Luke 2, when Simon sees them in the temple and prophesies and says, "Now, Lord, your servant can depart, for my eyes have seen your salvation." Matthew 15 and 17, when it talks about the prophecy that was fulfilled that says the country of Zebulun and Naphtali has seen a great light. It's like the light has been dawning, the sun has come up. All the joy that took place as a result of the revealing of the gospel. And we see this in Acts 8:4. When the disciples are fleeing from persecution, what are they doing? They're evangelizing. How many things, if I get chased out of town for doing something, that's generally a recommendation not to go tell people to go do this thing. And yet these people were passionate. They were excited. They were on fire for God. And when you think about this, look over Romans chapter 10. And again, this is another... Stephen stole a whole bunch of stuff I wanted to talk about, which I guess is to be expected because it's not nearly as big a book as sometimes we think it is. There's a lot of repetition. But I don't think you can talk about evangelism. You can't talk about the gospel without looking at Romans 10, because Romans 10 is a description of the process. How God has decided to reveal his word, how God is going to save us through the gospel of Christ. This is how it's going to work, and the only way it works is if you have evangelism, if you have a preacher. Look at how he describes this. We're going to read 5 through 17. It says, "For Moses writes about the righteousness that is based on the law, that the person who does the commandments shall live by them. But the righteousness based on faith says, do not say in your heart, who will ascend into heaven, that is to bring Christ down, who will descend into the abyss, that is to bring Christ up from the dead. But what does it say? The word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart, that is the word of faith that we proclaim. Because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved. For the scripture says, everyone who believes in him will not be put to shame. For there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, for the same Lord is Lord of all, bestowing his riches on all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Don't stop there for a second. You can just hear the excitement that's coming out of this. This idea that we have this news, as we talked about, this is not beyond you. The salvation of the Lord is right there for you. It's right here for you to get. It's accessible. You don't have to go up into heaven to find the Messiah. You don't have to raise him up for the dead. God has done all those things for you. He has given this opportunity for you to be saved. Now, what does he say? Verse 14, well, how will they call on him in whom they have not believed? How are they believe in him in whom they have never heard? How are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news, which we just read in Isaiah. But they have not all obeyed the gospel, for Isaiah said, Lord, who has believed what he has heard from us? So faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. Now, why do you think? And there's a lot that we can get out. We can just spend that time on this passage, and we'll go back to a couple of things that we've read here. And you probably picked up on a few things that are pretty important. But the key here for this point, well, is that God did not decide, I'm going to reveal the gospel to you by sending down a messenger from heaven, and he's going to go to each one of you and proclaim what God has done. In fact, that is never God's policy. All throughout the Old Testament, even in the times of the patriarchs, you know, we sometimes, I think, have this vision that God was just constantly working miracles and striking people dead and having bushes start burning and talking to people and giving them dreams and all that stuff. But really, that happened very, very rarely. And in fact, for the most part, the pattern is if God spoke at all, he spoke to one man and sent that man out, and everybody else in the world had to listen to him. The pattern was always that the good news, the gospel, was spread by an individual, by a preacher. And you ever wonder why that is? That's a kind of an unreliable way to do it, isn't it? Anybody's ever played the game telephone or whatever you want, whatever that name is called, and you start on one end, and, you know, that message is very, very different by the time it gets over here. Why would God choose such an unreliable method of translating and sending out his word? And I suggested it's in the idea of joy. You know, we talk about the idea of the foolishness of preaching, the foolishness of the message preached. The idea, why in the world would I use such an inefficient way to teach people about God? And I wonder, actually I'm skipping ahead, sorry. The idea of evangelism, I don't know why God chose to do what he did. But I suspect that there is a power that comes from someone who is telling you something that has affected their life, that goes much beyond anything else. You know, the whole, one of the great trends in the last couple of years in marketing has been influencer marketing. And for those of you you probably heard of somebody who's gotten on YouTube and gotten famous for doing something, whatever it might be. And all of a sudden they've got a whole lot of people wanting to send them money to advertise for them, because the idea is, this is a person that for whatever reason people seem to respect. And if that person shows the value of what they have, what this product or this service is, and they can see firsthand how this person is really enjoying that, that means something. A lot more than simply reading a letter that says, hey, by the way, you should do this, this, and this. I wonder sometimes whether the idea behind evangelism is that the power of personal testimony, not witnessing that we talk about, but the idea that as someone who is a Christian, someone who is a child of God, someone who has obeyed the gospel, has embraced it and is seeking it, and I know what it's done for my life, how much more important is it that I can go out and talk to somebody about that than someone who is just a disinterested person or a third party or something? Evangelism is a key part of the gospel, and that goes on this idea of joyfulness, of rejoicing in the gospel. And I asked the question I asked, I wonder sometimes if we've trained ourselves to be less evangelistic. And what I mean by that is, you know, we don't want to be, I don't know if anybody's ever watched The Simpsons before, but we don't want to be Ned Flanders. We don't want to be that guy. The next door neighbor who's just always happy, everything is positive, everything is wonderful, everything is about God, you know, always constantly, everybody hates that. We don't want to be that guy, and so we kind of tamp down the brakes a little bit. And over time, don't we kind of see among ourselves that we don't always seem to express the joy that we ought to express about our relationship to God? Are we talking about it through the week? Is it something that comes into our conversation? I've heard some people say, and I struggle with this a little bit, and I'm trying to be better about it, but Evangelizing ought to be the easiest thing in the world because we talk about things we care about all the time. But we've trained ourselves not to do that with God because we're told, well, you don't talk about politics, you don't talk about religion. We have to have joy in our message.